to kick off with, I was going to start to talk about state pensions, as currently most people are entitled to a state pension as long as you've paid national insurance, a minimum level of national insurance for at least 35 years, you get the maximum state pension, which currently is about £8,000 a year. That might not sound like a lot of money, but believe it or not, many of our clients, it does make up quite a significant proportion of their retirement incomes. It's not untypical to be 50% or more of their total income in retirement, which is a bit scary, really, because state pensions were a good idea when they were introduced many years ago. I think they started after the Second World War or thereabouts. And the idea of having a guaranteed income in retirement is quite reassuring. Obviously difficult to imagine when you're as young as you guys are, but it only seems like yesterday I was as young as you guys at university. It's staggering how fast the years fly by. So state pensions are a good idea in principle. And when they were introduced, there were a lot more people working to fund the people retired. The problem with state pensions and public sector pensions is they're known as unfunded pension schemes, by which I mean there's no money in the pot. There's literally no money saved for your retirement in state pensions and in virtually all public sector pension schemes, you know, like, for example, the police or the teachers' pension schemes. There's no money sitting in a pension to pay those pensions. It's just paid out of general government tax revenue every year. So you guys, I'm afraid, are the suckers who are paying for this. You'll be paying my state pension for years to come. So you've got every good reason not to be smiling at the moment. The problem is that when they were introduced, there were a lot more people working, as I said, to fund the people that were retired. The trouble is, this so-called dependency ratio is going to change dramatically during your lifetime. Today, there's approximately 3 people working for every 1 person retired, so it's just about affordable. But by 2050, there'll be 1 person working for every 1 retired. Now, you don't need to be a maths genius to work this out for yourself. It's going to be totally unaffordable. So the government won't come clean on this, because the last thing politicians want to tell you is the truth. Forgive my cynicism, but even at your young tender years, you understand that's true. So instead, they've started to increase the state retirement age to a later and later age. My sister was due to retire at 60 when men retired at 65, but then they decided to equalise state pensions, and it meant that she had to retire at 65, not 60. So she got to like 55 and suddenly she realised she had to work another 5 years. And then what the government then decided to do was to basically lengthen the age before you receive your state pension. And now it comes in phases, but you'll get your state pension between 65 and 68 now, depending on when you were born. So the later you're born, the later the state pension. So at the moment, you're all due to get your state pensions at 68. But before you attempted to smile, in my opinion, it's highly unlikely any of you guys will get a state pension. But nobody else will tell you that, because it's just impossible to mathematically afford it with a pay-as-you-go system. So I'm afraid you're all in what I call a Ponzi scheme. Have you heard of Ponzi? Yeah, it's a great Italian fraudster. Basically, it's a scheme where you keep paying money in, and the money only gets paid out by the latest people to pay money in. You eventually run out of money, and that's a Ponzi scheme. I'm afraid that's all you can describe state pensions as, and also public sector pensions, apart from probably the local government pension scheme and the university superannuation scheme. They're the 2 biggest schemes I know that are funded. There's actual money in the pot. Virtually all public sector pension schemes, there's no money there. So what they're having to do, the government, because the government has never ever paid money into a public sector pension scheme. I know it sounds staggering. You get your pay slip, you look at it, there's a deduction for pension contributions, and you know your employer, the government, is supposedly paying money in, but they're not. that is effectively a tax contribution you're paying. It's not really, because it's not going into a pot to be saved, it's spent every year. The money comes out of your pay packet. So what they're doing with public sector pensions, they're downgrading them, they're increasing the retirement age, and they've changed the formula, because a public sector pension, although it's apparently guaranteed, it's based on a formula, unlike a personal pension, which is more like an investment, which invests in shares, bonds, property, and cash. And what you get out of it, a personal pension, is based on how much you pay in and how well it grows, and how long you have it invested. Whereas a final salary pension is based on a formula, and the formula rewards you for long periods of service and for having a pretty high salary in either your last year of service or in the best 3 out of the last 10 years of service for that employer. The trouble is that the government and pension schemes are tinkering with the formulae, and that now, for example, I was speaking to a teacher the other day, and her pension is now based on career average earnings. So if in the past, let's give you a simple example. Let's say when you started teaching, you're earning 15 grand a year when you're 20, and you get to 60 and you're earning 100 grand a year. And let's say the maximum pension you can have is 50%. So you get to age 67, 68, you get your 50% pension, 50 grand a year, because your salary was 100 grand, you get 50% of that. That's 50 grand. That's a nice pension. Don't you agree? But if you start earning 15,000 a year, and by the time you get to 68, you're earning 100 grand a year, what is your career average earnings? It's a lot less than 100 grand, isn't it? Because you start at 15, end up at 100 over 40 odd years. Your average salary is probably about 55 grand. You follow me so far? Does that make sense? You start off at 50.
Yes.
Yeah, and after all those years, you've got to 100. Your career average is probably about 55. Well, so instead of getting 50% of 100 grand, your last year's salary, you're going to get 50% of 55 grand, which I work out to be 27.5 grand. Your pension's been slashed in half almost. You see what I'm getting at? So a subtle change in the formula will mean you get a smaller pension. Now, sorry I haven't got all this in words. You might be not following the drift necessarily, but what you will understand is when I say to you that the government's reducing the value of your public sector pensions, and typically by half, I think you'll find it's quite alarming. So I don't expect young people like you to even get a state pension because it's so unaffordable. And B, if you work in the public sector, you're probably going to find your pension is slashed in half. Now, you're probably not feeling uneasy because you probably, at your age, assuming you're all in your early 20s or late teens, you can't imagine ever being old enough to be retired. But believe you me, as I said earlier, it will go pass by very quickly. So the lesson here is, if you seriously don't want to be in absolute poverty in retirement, you need to start ploughing money into your pensions as soon as you get an opportunity. I know it's not a very sexy subject, because you leave university, what's the first thing you're going to want to do of any great value in your life financially, apart from spending your money? You're going to want to buy a house, aren't you? Probably. And that'll probably be your first step. But you'll probably join a company and they'll offer you what's called a workplace pension, because you have to pay into pensions. Employers have to provide pensions and you have to pay into it. And all I would say to you is, if you can afford to do it, plough as much money in as you can into your pension from an early age, because the more you pay in, the younger you are, the much greater pension you'll get at the end, because it's a pot of money that will grow more and more the longer you invest it. I presume you've covered compounding in your studies or at some stage or another, so you understand compound interest. How you earn interest on interest over time and how it just keeps growing exponentially. That's the way to do it. Not many younger people in my experience would plough loads of money into pensions in an early age, because your priorities are probably, apart from wanting to enjoy yourself, which I don't blame you, I was the same when I was young, going to spend money in your social life, but you probably not, your top priority probably isn't to pay money into a pension, but do take it seriously. It is important. And Leanne did say to me earlier, how much should a young person save from, say, their early 20s and to get a decent pension at 68? There's not an exact figure, but I wouldn't aim at less than 10% of your earnings. And the reason I would say that is because in my experience with clients, once you've got a monthly direct debit going out, you forget about it. Once it's gone out, you just spend the rest. So you might as well start off paying large amounts in, 10%. It feels like a lot at the start, but once you're used to that direct debit going out of the account, you'll just spend whatever's left. That's what most people do. So it's a good idea to pay quite a lot of money in, I would say, as soon as you possibly can, because you won't miss it once it keeps going in. Yeah, so that's state pensions and public sector pensions. So I know it sounds a bit alarming, but the thing that's coming in to rescue you with reduced public sector pensions and probably no state pension is that you've got these auto-enrolment or workplace pensions that have come in to replace them. And in my opinion, the government is secretly privatising the state pension scheme. That's what I think workplace pensions are. They won't tell you that, but by forcing employers to pay into workplace pensions and forcing employees to pay into them, they're doing it knowing that in 30 years' time, state pensions will be unaffordable. And I think state pensions will probably end up being means tested. So most university students being likely to be higher earners, you're the ones who will lose out the most. That doesn't mean it's all doom and gloom. The great thing that's coming your way, on average, not all of you, of course, but on average, most young people today, millennials, are likely to receive much bigger inheritances than anyone of my generation ever received. And the addition of bigger inheritances and workplace pensions means you will be well set in the future, although at the moment you probably feel like you're the disadvantaged generation. Whereas in fact, by the time it gets to my age, the average person will probably be wealthier than me because you will have inherited more money, you have a lot more money in a workplace pension, I would say. So Leanne did ask me to demonstrate this lifetime cash flow planning. So what I was going to suggest is if I go on to that now, otherwise I might ramble for hours and you might never even get to your lunch. I'm sure you don't want that. So if I just share the screen now, just bear with me a moment. I'll get the technology right. Can you see that screen?
No.
Not done it quite right, just a sec. Can you see that now?
Yes.
You can see, yes. You see the cash flow. Let me explain what this means. This is a lifetime cash flow forecast. You're probably looking at it and thinking, where's the figures? It's a cash flow forecast after all. Well, if you look down the left-hand side, you'll see these various numbers. That represents your cash inflow each year. When I say cash inflow, in 90% plus of the cases, we're talking about your salary or your pension. So that each bar here represents your total cash inflow or total income for that year. And this is a case of someone being age 55, for example. So as you see, they've got income, it's quite a high income, but this, let's face it, you're all bright young fellas and girls there. You're going to be earning about this much money in 10 years' time anyway, aren't you? You should be smiling now. Anyway, so if you're earning, say, 120 grand a year to start off with, and then the income goes up and then you retire. So in this case, someone's retiring at about 65 and then their income drops. Now, there's also, so not only each of these columns represents your total cash inflow for the year, the black line there represents your total expenditure. So in this example, someone is earning 120,000 a year and they're spending 80,000 a year. By the way, that includes their taxes because this income is income before deduction of tax. So what you've got here is someone in a very good position financially because they've got £40,000 surplus income because their income's 120, their expenditure's 80. That's a very healthy position to be in for any client. What I can do is give you a more detailed breakdown of what that income consists of. So if you go into detail, if you look at the key at the bottom there, you'll see in this example, looking at the colours there of each bar, employment incomes. This person has got that like light blue employment income up until 65. Then they retire, and the income then changes. So, for example, the green there you'll see is their own pension income. The dark blue is the state pension that kicks in. And as I said to you earlier, look at how much the state pension is as a percentage of total income, top black line. It's quite a lot, isn't it? And this light blue means this person doesn't have enough pension income, so they're subsidising their pensions with money out of their savings and investments down here. So also what's changed is that their income was well in excess of their expenditure here until 65, and suddenly their income only matches their expenditure. Now, there's a reason for that. It's not because it's a coincidence that their income equals their expenditure. It's because the system we use, this cash flow system, defaults to give the client as much income as they need to meet their expenditure. So it's linked to their expenditure. This is their expenditure needs in retirement, about 30 grand a year. So they just take enough money out of their savings and investments to subsidise their pensions to meet their expenditure. And then you've got this great big tax charge at 75. You're probably thinking, what on earth's going on there? Well, unfortunately, this client was a victim of their own success. They managed to build a pension scheme that was worth well over £1 million. And because they were fortunate enough to survive beyond 75, they got hit by a tax charge. There is a tax charge if you take benefits out of a pension scheme that exceed what's called the lifetime allowance limit. And the lifetime allowance limit is a very odd figure. It's £1,073,100. Why the government didn't decide to round it to the nearest £5,000 is beyond me. So although it looks disastrous, it's not as bad as it seems, because that tax charge is taken out of the pension that you've built up. I'll explain to you in a minute why it doesn't have that big an effect on you than you think. Because when you look at that there and think, hang on a minute, this person's paid a tax charge of like nearly £200,000. You can look at the figures over there. But in fact, it's not as bad as it seems. And I'll explain to you in a moment when I go on to the next chart. So does that all make sense? I mean, you're all very quiet there, guys. I don't mind if you ask me a question if I'm not explaining it clearly enough. By all means, do ask a question. Now's a good opportunity to ask if you're not sure. Does it make sense so far? Do you follow me? Is it clear enough?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's very easy to follow.
Right. Okay. Now, what you can also do, if you are more someone who analytical wants to see the figures behind it, or we can reveal all the figures. This is just a nice graphic presentation, because most people's style of learning is to learn by graphics. They prefer graphics, pictures to numbers and words. But I can give you the numbers behind it. So there's a basic summary. So total need, total income need, all cash inflows, money coming in, for example, from employment. So I'll then give you the detailed breakdown. So this person here, they've got two jobs, Timmy, bit of a silly name for an example, but they're always silly names, aren't they? Then you've got the breakdown of the expenditure. And what we do, we have to do this with every client. We have to have a breakdown of all their income and expenditure. If only because it helps us to plan ahead. Because your income and expenditure change as you get older, typically your income will reduce, but then your expenditure will reduce as well. And then you just live your life accordingly. Your needs change. So it's good to have the breakdown, and we even have a breakdown of the various investments, pensions, etc. So we can come on to that in a moment. Let's come out of that. What I would also wanted to show you, so that's the cash flow. Have you studied accounts in your study so far? You know, balance sheets, profit and loss accounts. Have you done that sort of thing before? Yeah. Well, think of this as like a profit and loss account in a way, but it's actual cash. And then what we also then do with clients, we also say, let's have a look at your personal balance sheet or family balance sheet, like the assets you own, minus any liabilities. But quite frankly, when clients get to retirement, in my experience, they don't have any debts. So you'll find like your parents or grandparents, they got to the stage of life and they don't owe any money. They paid the mortgage off. They don't have any debts. And then all they've got left is assets. So in this example, there's a further breakdown of their assets down here. Look at the colour code down here. Now, the non-liquid assets is a bit of a fancy term, but it means anything you own that you can't immediately sell, like today. And usually the purple represents their property they live in, the principal private residence. The pink there is the savings, which means money in the bank. The blue represents their investments and the green represents their pensions. These aren't final salary pensions. These are money purchase or personal pensions where you've actually got actual money in the pot. And you can see the asset that grows the most in this example is the pension. You see the value of it gets bigger and bigger as years go by. And that's because what we have to do to produce a cash flow forecast, we have to use certain assumptions. So we make assumptions about interest rates, inflation, investment returns, etc. And all of our cash flow forecasts are very conservative. We don't want, we like to under promise and over deliver. And what we're helping clients to achieve is to achieve the desired lifestyle in retirement and not worry about running out of money, because that is the biggest fear of people who get to typically around about age 50. They start thinking, hang on, have I got enough money to retire on? And that's when they want to do more serious planning. This is why I say to you, if you can plough money into pensions very early, you'll be fabulously wealthy at a later age. You don't have to worry about running out of money, particularly in light of state pensions, be it the demise of state pensions and the reduction in public sector pensions, which I forecast to come. So again, we can find out what each of these assets are by going into these summaries here. So we'd be looking at what type of investments do they own, what type of pensions do they own, etc. So clients find that very helpful and very reassuring when we can. So we meet with them every year. We get them to update their financial information, and then we take them through these cash flow forecasts, and they're mightily relieved that they've got enough income to meet their expenditure up until their dotage. We do it up to age 100. You can't see it on the screen here, I think, because the cameras are covering it. But so we assume everyone lives to age 100. Of course they don't, but I think clients quite like that. We did have a client, 94-year-old, came to the office the other day, and his cash flow forecast was quite short. He only showed 6 years till he died at age 100. I thought, I better change that to 110, I think. He might get a bit disappointed when he gets to 99. He's got 1 year left to live. So we will change that. What we could also do on the system, when someone comes to the office, the first thing we do is we make a note of their names, and the relationships, husband, wife, children, grandchildren. And then we'll plot these time scales. So for example, this was a very simplistic one. We've got a pre-retirement phase from 55 to 65, and then a post-retirement phase, 65 onwards. But you can drop in many what we call what-if scenarios. So for example, let's say we've got a client we had recently who wanted to do a lot of traveling. They were retiring early at 55 and they wanted to travel for the next 15 years. So you could download travel to here to create another time horizon from 55 to 70. And then you plot in the extra expenditure they'll need for those 15 years. So let's say this client was going to spend 20 grand a year for 15 years. You can then build that into the cash flow forecast and see if they can afford it. And believe it or not, it might seem simplistic, but most people don't really have a clue what they can or can't afford. And this is very enlightening. People find it very useful indeed to know that they can afford a lifestyle they never dreamt they could afford. And also we've had many clients we've helped to retire early. And would you like to, I know you haven't started work yet, would you like the idea of having the option of retiring 10 years earlier? Would you like that? I think the answer is yes, isn't it? So you don't have to retire early. I mean, I'm 62. I don't have any intention of retiring for the foreseeable future because I love what I do, but not everyone is in that unfortunate position. A lot of people are in jobs they hate. And so we have clients that can't wait till retire. So this is an incredibly powerful model to use, and it's incredibly practical. We find clients absolutely love it. We can even throw in a midlife crisis for you. Look, we've had a few people in that situation. I wouldn't be cheeky enough to put that down as a time planning tool, but we just have a joke about it. I've had a few clients lately in the mid-40s and going through a bit of midlife crisis. Some admit to it and others don't. There's various other modules on here, which I won't have time to go into today, but you can do estate planning to save inheritance tax. You can list all their assets. You can even put in life insurance, windfalls. A lot of clients come into inheritances, sometimes very significant amounts. We build all that into the cash flow. Most people are going to inherit something, and we'll build that in and make an assumption. It's a bit sensitive. You don't know. Someone comes to you and they say, oh, my parents are in their 80s, and you don't want to, say they're going to die in the next 2 years, but you typically might say, well, if they're in good health, let's assume they'll live another 10 years, for example, and then you build in the lump sums they're going to receive from that. A very useful tool we find is when clients come to us who might be, say, pre-retirement, might be retiring early, let's say at 55, for example, but they're not going to receive a state pension until they're 67. They may have these personal pensions, and they may also have final salary pensions and state pensions to come. So we say to them, why don't we help you plan how much income to withdraw from your personal pensions between 55 and say 68, when you draw your state pension and your final salary pension will be drawn by then, usually by 65 final salary pension. So what we can help them do is bridge that gap between, say, 55 and 65 before a final salary pension kicks in. And one thing Leanne did ask me to cover was what would be a safe or sustainable level of income to withdraw from investments and personal pensions so that the capital value doesn't fall. And this is where it becomes quite interesting, because while we're on the subject, I might as well explain to you what I think it should be. You're probably looking at an income withdrawal rate of around about 3%, maybe 2.5% a year. So in other words, to keep it simple, let's say you're fortunate enough to have £1 million in your pension pot. And that sounds like a lot of money now, but believe you me, you can achieve it. Everyone in this webinar today can achieve £1 million in savings from leaving university by age 65, as long as they save 10% a year of their income. I believe every one of you can do it. And that's in addition to any state pension you may receive or any workplace pension. And the reason I know with confidence, because I wrote a section of it in my book here on page 25, where it shows an example of someone saving 10% of their earnings every year for 40 years, based on an average salary as well, which at the time of writing was $27,000 a year, and making an investment return of 10%, which admittedly is a bit on the high side, but definitely achievable. Our own investment strategy, the wealth investment strategy, has got a 24-year track record, and it averages 9.4% a year. And I would describe it as a conservative investment strategy. It's not shoot the lights out. It's not intended to be, because it involves investing in a spread of assets, diversifying risk, not having everything in shares, for example. So it is achievable. It seems a bit high at the moment, but it definitely is achievable. So we find that as a very useful tool. So sometimes, even though I might say to clients, a safe level of income withdrawal to preserve your capital is 3% of the amount invested. So £1 million will give you 30,000 a year. In reality, if a client's needs to bridge a gap, they've got not enough income for that 10 years, we may agree to them taking out a lot more than 3%, because we know once the state pension kicks in at 65, they can then reduce their income below 3%. So, for example, they might take an income out of, say, 5% a year for 10 years, which is too high to probably to sustain the value of the capital. The capital may fall. But then once it gets 65, we might reduce their income to, say, 2%. And then it's got a chance to recover again. The phase before retirement, you know, academically, is the accumulation phase, the phase during which you're building up your savings and investments before retirement. And when you start taking income after retirement, they call it decumulation. But to me, that implies that you're only going to grow your money before retirement, and it's going to reduce in value after retirement. As a financial planner, I don't like that. All my clients, I expect their wealth to continue increasing post-retirement, even though they're taking an income, which is why it's important that I guide them not to take too much income out, particularly in times like today when inflation and interest rates are so low. It's very hard to achieve an investment return of much more than, I'd say, about 5% a year if you're spreading your risk and not having all your eggs in one basket. If you're spreading it across different asset classes like bonds, property, cash, and equities, which is felt to be the safe way to diversify risk, it's very hard to achieve a return of 10% a year when inflation interest rates are virtually zero. History shows that you can't get an excess return of 10% a year. It's virtually impossible. So for the next few years, it's likely that returns will be lower. And if you can make 5% a year for a client, net of charges, you're probably doing quite well. If you are prepared to take more risk, and at your young ages, you can afford to be what I would call high risk investors, by which I don't mean the risk of losing all your money. All I mean is that the fluctuations in value of your investments, the volatility, I'm sure you're all familiar with that branch of your study, your standard deviation, volatility. You can afford at your age to take far greater risk. I'm not talking about risk of losing your money. I'm just talking about the fluctuations in value will be greater if you invest a lot more into shares and, for example, into more adventurous sectors of the economy. Then you can do it at your age because you've got a long time for it to grow. So you could probably be high risk investors, whereas your grandparents would probably be low risk investors because they haven't got so long for the money to grow. So I hope that makes sense as well. I can probably come out of the cash flow now. I think, yeah, I don't think I need to be in it much.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'll cover the basics there for now. Yeah. So I'll stop the screen sharing for now. Just to further expand on this safe income withdrawal rate, there was a study, a US study about 20 years ago, and what they did in this study, they worked out if you invested 50% in shares and 50% in government stocks, what income level could you take without it reducing the value of your money invested, your capital? And what they discovered was you could take 4% income and your capital would not go down. It would be, your income would be inflation proofed, like an inflation proof pension. The trouble is that was 20 years ago. Aegon did a more recent study and they discovered that the sustainable income level you need to take, depending on your attitude to investment risk, would need to be nearer 1.7% to 3.6% a year. So that's quite a lot lower. That's why I think you're probably looking at a safe withdrawal rate of maybe 2.5%, which is a plumb in the middle of 1.7 to 3.6%. So again, back to the example of £1 million, that would be 25,000 a year you could take and probably be sustainable, because you're going to have to make an investment return of more than 2.5% a year net of charges, and charges could, depending on where you're invested, could probably vary between 0.5% a year and maybe as much as 2% a year, depending on what type of investment service you're getting. That's why I think if you're looking at a growth rate of maybe 5% a year, that gives you a safe margin to maybe take 2.5%, maybe 3%, to preserve your capital and give you a chance for your income to grow in line with inflation, which you'll need in retirement, because unfortunately prices have a tendency to rise, although they've not been rising much in recent years. And this may shock you, but I don't know if you've studied, well, yeah, if the students have studied interest rates and inflation going back over the decades, but I did a recent article on the last 200 years of interest rates. And I lived through the 1970s when interest rates averaged in their teens. Inflation averaged in its teens every year throughout the 70s. And interest rates got to a peak of 17% at one stage, base interest rates in the UK, 17%. Today, the base rate is 0.1%. If you're taking out a mortgage as a young person, you can be lucky enough to get a mortgage, even on a fixed rate, a mortgage interest rate of 2 or 3%. But I remember at one stage, I don't know if you remember, because I don't know if you're in the UK here then, yeah, I remember at one stage in, I think late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, when I was paying 15.4% interest on my mortgage. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
And I remember inflation, as I say, was in the teens on average every year in the 70s. And I remember when inflation got to 29% at one stage.
Wow.
Sounds like a third world country, doesn't it?
Mm.
On the other hand, you did have other advantages then. You did have smaller mortgages because, of course, property prices were a lot cheaper then. So although it seems daunting and how did you afford it, somehow it was still affordable, but it was quite tight when interest rates went very high. And around the corner, inflation and interest rates are inevitably going to rise. Now, I don't think we'll go back to the levels of the 70s, but you are going to get much higher interest rates and inflation because this is what happens at this stage of the long-term economic cycle. And by long-term, I'm talking about 50 to 75 years. I don't know if your students ever read any Ray Dalio books, Leanne, but if they don't, I'd highly recommend them because the guy's an absolute genius. Ray Dalio runs the biggest hedge fund in the world, Bridgewater Associates, that manages $160 billion. Ray Dalio is ranked the 50th richest man in the world and the 50th most significant person in the world, most influential person in the world by independent studies. And he's written a series of brilliant books, absolutely brilliant books, that cover long-term economic cycles, which he calls long-term debt cycles. It's fairly academic. It's quite challenging to read, but he goes back 5,000 years.
Wow.
Studying the economies of the world and empires throughout the world. He goes back as, and the longest he goes back is to cover Chinese dynasties. And he says the patterns in long-term economic cycles or debt cycles, as he fashions them, always repeat. And we're at a stage now in the long-term debt cycle where the next emergent empire, China, is going to overtake the current biggest empire, the US, if you can describe it as an empire. He describes it as an empire. And what it means is that China is going to overtake the US and leave it way, way behind. It's already happening. China's a country that's got a population of 4 times the size of the United States. And I've personally experienced China. I've been there a couple of times in recent years. I know from first-hand experience, if you live in a city, you have a lot of surplus income. What they're doing in America, in China, is transforming it from an export-led economy to a domestic economy. Because most economies, their GDP is primarily from domestic consumption. And the US is very much like that. And so the Chinese, who are incredibly clever at having very, very long-term plans, their governments typically have 50-year plans. Whereas people like Donald Trump have 5-minute plans, which he tweets about. You know, it's little wonder China's taken over the world. But China, the plan is to have a per capita disposable income on a par with Americans. And it will happen, it's just a matter of time. And when that happens, their economy will be 4 times the size of the US. And I think it will happen very easily and probably within the next 20 years. I think it'll overtake the US economy in the next 5. It's almost certainly going to happen. So, and because the same patterns emerge every time in long-term debt cycles, what happens is that the existing empire borrows too much money. And what happens is that the value of assets gets inflated. And then what follows is that, and interest rates get to rock bottom, what then follows is that their currency will be depreciated. They'll devalue their currency. Inflation will return, and the US has already announced that they're happy to let inflation run, and interest rates will rise. So this is the next stage of the long-term economic cycle. It's going to happen, and China will become the #1 empire in the world. The next thing that will be under threat will be the US dollar, which is the reserve currency of the world, which doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment because the US used to dominate world trade, but they don't anymore. What they do have is some amazing large tech companies, but the dollar is under threat, and it's likely in the next 10 years that it'll be replaced by another currency. I don't think it'll be the Chinese yuan, but I think it'll be some form of digital currency will become the new reserve currency of the world. So just watch this space, just be wary of that. So get back to the income withdrawals I mentioned. I think I've covered that in enough length now. I think 2.5% is about the right level of income withdrawal. I've already covered the issue of state pensions and public sector pensions. I don't want it to sound gloomy or alarmist, but I just think it's important at your young age just to be aware of what's likely to happen around the corner. That don't rely on the state, I think is the main message to come through, because you've got to rely on yourself going forward. You can't rely on state aid like we've have done up to now. You've got to build your own wealth. And with your own wealth, gives you a lot more freedom, to be able to do the things you want when you want to do it and live the life you choose rather than be at the mercy of an employer or hoping the government will bail you out. I mean, there's so much debt been taken on by governments in the world. I think it's unsustainable and it's a danger to the world because it's going to, because taxpayers are going to have to pay it back one day, somehow or other. You can't just keep borrowing money on the never never and hoping it will just go away. It'll have long-term economic effects, which I think will be quite dire over the next 10 years. Because this is it's a bit like trying to fund a world war. The amount of debt that's been taken on, it will have negative consequences. But as I said to you, to be on the bright side, the good news is that, as I said to you earlier, that millennials will end up being the richest generation of all, although it doesn't feel like it at the moment. You're probably sitting there thinking, oh, I can't afford to buy a house. I've got to fund these state pensions for a lot of old people. It's not fair. But for the reasons I gave you, greater inherited wealth and workplace pensions, you're actually set to be the wealthiest generation in history, but you won't feel it at the moment. I hope that gives you a good idea overall. I've deliberately left 10 minutes for questions. If you've got any questions you'd like to raise, don't be shy. And remember, as I'm sure Liam would tell you, there's no such thing as a silly question.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tony. Anyone got any questions for Tony? This is your opportunity to ask him anything you want. Shivani, do you want to ask a question?
No, I don't have any questions.
Yeah. What about cash flow or anything? I think Tony has been working as a financial planner for the last 35 years, Tony?
Since 1986. So that makes me quite ancient. Yeah, that's
34 years then.
34 years.
Yeah.
And it's something I still love doing to this day. I love helping clients out. I love helping them retire early. I love giving them good news, saving them tax, making them wealthy, giving them loads of money to pass down to their children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, unfortunately, because with the COVID-19, we can't not, take you to visit Wealth and Tax in Milton Keynes. But last year, I think we organised visits to the company, to Tony's office, and it's very nicely located just by the lake in Milton Keynes. Yeah, so it's pity with COVID we can't do that, but hopefully with the talk today, you can see the kind of thing Tony does with his clients to help them achieve wealth and security and retirement planning. So anyone else, Martinez, Sima, Zara, any questions for Tony?
They're either stunned into silence or they're bored rigid.
I think I mean, obviously, what you've been saying, I mean, we only started working on pensions the last 2 weeks, so it's still quite new to them. So
Yeah.
hopefully by the end of the course, they will learn more about pensions, but hopefully today's talk will give them a lot of food for thought and would inspire them to maybe take actions to, I don't know, build wealth and get on the property ladder and, you know, do things they want to do. So the to save £1 million should be the goal for most young people, yeah? And they should be able to do it if they saved about 10% of their annual salary a year.
Yeah, once you set that direct debit up, as I said earlier, it's amazing how you get used to it. It's the thought of doing it that puts people off. But the most successful people I've come across are the ones who literally just spend less than they earn. I know it sounds incredibly simple, but that's the thing that most people fail to do. Because the thing is, we're all driven by wants rather than needs. And if you can be disciplined and control yourself so you don't, because when you think about it, we all like things, we all like to buy things, we like to eat nice food, we like nice clothes, etc. But there's no limit to your wants, but there is a limit to your needs. And if you can discipline yourself to not just spend all your money, I know it sounds boring, but your generation needs to save money more than ever because of the lack of government support going forward. And I think it just gets into that discipline. I've had clients who've managed to retire. I've got clients who get to the late 40s and they're already financially free and early 50s. And they still have a good lifestyle, lots of holidays and do things they want, because ironically, by being disciplined and saving money, they actually end up with more money than all their friends when it comes to retirement. And they end up spending a lot more money in retirement and give a lot more money to their children than the people who've spent it all their lives, who end up having a retirement in poverty. And the other thing to bear in mind is that life expectancy for you guys is going to increase dramatically during your lifetime. It's already predicted in the next 20 years, the average life expectancy will go from 80 to 120. And some experts believe that the first person to live to 1,000 has already been born.
Wow, really? Wow.
Unfortunately, it's not going to be me or Leanne.
Wow, that's quite scary, isn't it, Tony?
It is scary.
On that positive note, well, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for your time. It's been quite interesting to hear your views and your recommendation about the books to read. So Ray Dalio's book, which one would you recommend the student to read?
Well, there's more than one. There's Principles
of Success.
Wonderful Principles. Another one, Long-Term Debt Cycles. And I think there's another one he's doing at the moment on Changing Empires. I haven't got the full title of the books. There's about 3 books.
Yes,
course,
I think this.
not forgetting this book I wrote.
Yes, Wealth Magic as well. So next time I come to campus, I can bring a copy of that to show them.
I've given a few copies away in the past, for sure.
Yeah. I've got a copy in I think might have some copies in my room. So if any one of you want to look at Tony's book, I think it's quite very interesting to read it. If I got a spare copy, I'm happy to give you a copy. Yeah. So Tony, thank you very much for your time, as always.